Chinese President Xi Jinping repeats calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during a virtual meeting with leaders from BRICS member countries. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a speech before BRICS countries, Chinese President Xi Jinping called for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a secure and unimpeded humanitarian corridor in Gaza. Xi also emphasized the need for a two-state solution and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine. We begin with this report from Liu Juexin in Beijing.
The escalating situation in Gaza has brought leaders of the BRICS countries together, seeking ways to ease the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Chinese President Xi Jinping attended the virtual summit and elaborated on China's position. He called on the parties to the conflict to end hostilities and achieve ceasefire immediately. President Xi said humanitarian corridors must be kept secure and unimpeded, and more humanitarian assistance should be provided to the population in Gaza. President Xi also emphasized that the only viable way to break the cycle of Palestinian-Israeli conflicts lies in a two-state solution, in the restoration of the legitimate national rights of Palestine, and in the establishment of an independent state of Palestine. It was the first summit since the expansion of BRICS. The 15th BRICS leaders meeting held in August this year made a political decision on membership expansion and formally invited Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Argentina, and Ethiopia to become official BRICS members from January 1st, 2024. These new member countries also attended the summit on Tuesday. More than 13,000 people have been killed in Gaza since the bombardment began on October 7th. In Israel, the official death toll in Hamas's attack stands at about 1,200. At this summit, both the BRICS countries and the new member states generally held similar positions. They call for a ceasefire, the protection of civilians, and humanitarian relief. This forms an important basis to the summit. And President Xi Jinping not only delivered a speech and explained China's positions, but also demonstrated China's image as a responsible major country upholding international fairness and justice. He also called on all parties to build consensus to the greatest extent possible and unify their voices to promote the de-escalation of conflicts and the restoration of peace. 刘嘉欣 CGTN 北京。
For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Cape Town, South Africa, is Ebrahim Rasool. He is the former South African ambassador to the United States. Also with us, Nabeel Khoury is a former U.S. diplomat and non-resident senior fellow with the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. From London, Abdel Atwan is the editor-in-chief of al-Youm, and Zoon Ahmed is a research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Zoon, let's start with these Chinese diplomatic efforts to resolve this humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We have two efforts underway at the moment. Let's start with the first one. There's a delegation of Arab foreign ministers in Beijing right now holding talks with Chinese officials. They include foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine as well. President Xi is proposing a three-point plan to resolve this. What can you tell us about this plan?
Thank you, Anand, for having me. And of course, in the last 6 weeks, and especially since we last spoke, we have seen an onslaught of Gazan civilians, in particular women and children, that was unexpected, unprecedented. And I think what's really happened in the last few weeks is a series of miscalculations by leaders in certain parts of the world. But coming to the summit, I'll firstly begin with saying that the one country today in the world that has not only the capacity, but also the demonstrated, intention to de-escalate existing conflicts and misunderstandings between countries in the Middle East in particular is China. We saw March this year, the Saudi-Iran peace deal, which was unprecedented, historic. It is also important, before we come to this meeting, and why potentially Beijing was the first stop of this very important delegation, that in June this year, Mahmoud Abbas was in Beijing, who met with President Xi. And again, at that time, President Xi emphasized that we need to stick to a peace deal. The international community has to play its important role in economically aiding the people of Palestine, and also that there is no compromise on the two-state solution, the 1967 borders, based on the international law. that the world has agreed to. Coming to this delegation, yes, this is the first stop. The expectation of this delegation is to visit each P5 country, starting with China, and to basically amass diplomatic support to push for a ceasefire. And one development that we do see right now, which was reported by Haaretz, was that 308 trucks have been allowed to enter. Israel has agreed to allow 308 trucks to enter Gaza. It has also decided on a swap between 150 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 50 hostages. So we see that, whether or not this is a direct consequence of the existing meeting happening between Beijing and what we are calling the Arab Islamic Extraordinary Summit between Beijing and these leaders, it is definitely a push forward. Another important factor is that China has been committed in its communication and in its actions from the start, from years, but also in particular since the start of this conflict, to talk about reducing hostilities, a ceasefire, and also sticking to the international law. And Wang Yi has particularly mentioned in this summit, in his official communication, that we need to use the United Nations Security Council, the General Assembly. We need to respect international law. And the only real way forward, the only sustainable way forward is a peace deal, is dialogue, is actually sitting on the table for both sides and think of a long-term lasting solution. I'll additionally add that even President Xi has had a call with Macron, and they also have agreed. This is another very important development, that they both agreed to the ceasefire and a two-state solution as a lasting solution. So it's an important. These are important days in terms of the diplomatic headways that are happening in terms of easing the conflict.
Right. Another one of those diplomatic efforts, Zoon, is the one which has been launched by the BRICS group of countries. It's a virtual summit. It's going to be hosted by South Africa and also includes future BRICS members. These are BRICS members who will become which will become members of the grouping officially next year. They include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. This is a powerful group of countries. What do they bring to the table?
Again, they have all agreed. We, especially looking at President Xi's own statement during this summit, has been to, again, commit that we need an immediate ceasefire. We need to reduce the hostilities. We should not stoke tensions. We need to follow international law. And we need to think about further moving forward a two-state solution according to the 1967 borders. I mean, this is a very important message. And there has also been a suggestion that we need to build international consensus for peace and work towards an early solution. And there needs to be an international peace conference. An important aspect to understand here is that China and the majority of the world have been on the same page about when it comes to reducing the hostility and tension.
Okay, Ambassador Rasool, let's talk about the BRICS diplomatic effort to bring an end to the carnage in Gaza. This is being held at the invitation of South Africa. South Africa is in fact hosting that virtual summit. What kind of leverage does the group have in trying to end this?
Look, I think that the group has had enormous leverage given just its sheer emerging markets and developing economies. And so when it convened in South Africa earlier this year, it was 40% of the world's population, a third of the world's GDP, etc., etc., etc. It then added a set of new countries, and 4 of them, as Zoon has said, comes from the region, the Middle Eastern region, and they have been brought into this in order for them, together with the original BRICS countries, to put their minds together and to put their efforts together. And so I think South Africa's raison d'être, its reason for convening the BRICS summit, is because it has seen here were efforts by China, led by President Xi, here were the region coming together, and here were other BRICS countries very concerned about the humanitarian crisis and calling for ceasefires, and saying, why don't we collect our voices as emerging economies and actually speak to the hypocrisy that it sees in the West and the license to kill that the West has effectively given to Israel in retaliation for what has happened on the 7th of October. And so I think that the core framing that President Ramaphosa brought to the BRICS discussions today has been that there must not just be a ceasefire, but that the ceasefire needs to be patrolled by a multinational peacekeeping force, and that the United States could not be the lone gendarme in the region, and that the other BRICS countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran, may have to be part of that, that a humanitarian corridor needs to be established, and we've heard that some of that aid is beginning to flow, that there must be restraint from all sides, not just both sides, but all sides, that even the United States must be restrained in the kind of military hardware and intelligence and leadership that it is providing to Israel, that there must be an exchange of hostages for prisoners, and we're beginning to see that we're on the verge of some kind of breakthrough there, that there must be a resumption of peace talks, not only for the immediate peace and conflict resolution, but for the long-term solution that would be sustainable. And so I think this is very, very important. And just to add that South Africa came into this initiative having before this already, just as we speaking now, the South African Parliament has voted to suspend the Israeli presence in South Africa and to close the Israeli embassy until a ceasefire is in place and negotiations start. It has demarched the Israeli ambassador, who today has been recalled back to Israel. It has recalled South African diplomatic staff from Israel, and it has referred the matter for investigation, the Netanyahu government, for investigation to the International Criminal Court because of the genocide and the potential war crimes that emerge from there. So I think this is a very, very important initiative by BRICS that lends weight to the initiatives already by President Xi in convening Muslim and Arab countries, their foreign ministers in China over the last days.
Right. Abdel, Bari, Atwan, talking about the hostages, we've seen several reports recently about a possible temporary truce in Gaza, and that truce would include the release of about 50 hostages held by Hamas in exchange for Palestinian prisoners that are being held by Israel. There would also be a multi-day pause in the violence. What is your reading of these developments?
Well, I believe it is very good step because people in Gaza, and Mr. Anna, and I am from Gaza, people are really suffering. Until now, around 15,000 people were murdered, half of them children, and more than two-thirds of them are also innocent people, women. So more than 35,000 injured. So I believe this, hopefully, this ceasefire, it is true for only 5 days, as what the report's saying, but it will stop the bloodshed temporarily in Gaza, and also allowed about 300 vans of human aids to enter Gaza Strip. This is from the human side. If you look at the political side, I believe when the Israeli accept this truce or ceasefire, it means they realize that they cannot actually achieve the release of their hostages by military means, and they have to talk to Hamas. The Israelis said, Benjamin Netanyahu said from the day one that we are not going to have a ceasefire unless we actually mop out Hamas from the map, completely destroy it, and also release all our hostages taken by Hamas in Gaza. So he could not achieve any of these actually conditions, and now he is talking. He is under very, very heavy pressure from the international community to stop this war and to talk. And I believe what the Chinese president said today, it was very clear to stop the relocation of the Palestinian people, to actually resume the supply of water, supply of electricity, supply of the internet, and to put an end to these attacks against the hospitals. So it was really, now we are movement toward a ceasefire, which actually could be renewed and to put an end to this war. The American could not actually, adopt the Israeli policies, support the Israeli, while at the same time, it is fighting a war in Ukraine. I believe Gaza war gave the BRICS groups, gave Russia a huge gift from God, to divert the attention from Ukraine, and nobody is actually mentioning now the Ukraine war. So I believe stopping this war in Gaza, I believe it is essential, and also to look for a permanent solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, to the Palestinian question.
Nabeel Khoury, there's of course a hive of diplomatic activity in Beijing to try and bring this carnage to an end. Abdel Bari Atwan just mentioned that statement from the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Let's listen to part of it.
The international community must act urgently and take practical and effective measures to prevent this tragedy from spreading. Since the outbreak of the conflict, China has stood firmly on the side of justice. We have been working hard to de-escalate the conflict, protect the safety of civilians, expand humanitarian assistance, and prevent a humanitarian disaster. We call for a return to the two-state solution and the early realization of a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Palestine issue.
So, Nabeel, we now have these negotiations for the release of the hostages in exchange for the release of prisoners being held by Israel. Those negotiations are reported to be in a critical and final stage. After 7 weeks of extreme violence by Israel, what is your assessment of where things stand right now?
Unfortunately, we may feel a sense of achievement with any ceasefire, even if temporary, and any saving of human lives through assistance that can possibly get into Gaza. But the real obstacle remains the vote at the UN Security Council for a real comprehensive ceasefire. Now, China's influence in the Middle East has been growing, and the recent words and the summit in Beijing form an important moral support for the Palestinian point of view. However, in order to have an impact on the ground, China needs to be able to influence the US position so that the US would no longer use its veto and stop a resolution in favor of a ceasefire. So the impact diplomatically has to happen at the UN Security Council level, and the US veto is still an obstacle. China and perhaps other friends of the US need to be able to have some influence here in Washington. The other thing is that if we don't have a ceasefire, there may be a pause, but then a resumption of bombardment. I think the Israeli government is not planning on stopping for good. The preparations are for an invasion or at least an aerial bombardment of the southern part of Gaza. So I'm afraid for the time being, there's more bloodshed on the way.
Zoon, Nabeel makes a key point there. In addition to China talking to those involved in the Middle East and what is going on there, it would also have to convince the United States to go along with this plan and to not use its veto in the UN Security Council.
I completely agree with that point. And I think, as he also mentioned, as weeks ago we thought, this is probably the tail end. But we have only seen the hostility, the escalation, and as you called it, the carnage worsen. And my view personally right now, looking at the number of American people taking to the streets, the way the masses are protesting against this violation of basic human dignity, the way Israeli propaganda is failing to convince people, even the BBC and other mainstream Western media are now trying to say, the justification doesn't add up. So I think the real pressure, of course, there needs to be a pressure, and as you also mentioned, from Beijing and from other partners. Even Emmanuel Macron is now on the same page. We have this delegation. They need to have more impact and presence in Washington. But at the same time, they also, I think the people, the American people, and the growing, mistrust of Israeli government, the fact that Israel's narrative that it is a victim is not convincing people, might add pressure on the Biden administration as well. And we know that there's going to be an election next year. We know that, which I also previously mentioned, is, I do believe, a miscalculation of the degree to which people are aware of the situation on the ground, the degree to which Netanyahu actually went to ensure that as many Palestinians, as many Gazans are suffering, the kind of coverage we're seeing from the West Bank, all of that was probably not expected. I do believe that these leaders, these Western powers, their representatives, they did not expect the kind of public backlash, the kind of sentiment, historic levels of marches, demonstrations against what's happening in Gaza either. So the political pressure domestically can add up.
Right. Ambassador Rasool, you were the South African ambassador to the United States. Why do you believe United States President Biden is so reluctant to take firmer action to bring this violence to an end? In fact, he is actually supplying more weapons to Israel. And it appears domestically to be political suicide if one looks at the poll numbers a year before the presidential election. He is losing badly in the polls.
Look, I think he has made a fatal miscalculation, as Zoon says, about public sentiment in the United States. He was understanding that there was a traditional Jewish lobby and Zionist lobby that he needs to appease. He jumped on it, boots and all, and then began to see the public backlash. Now, Ronald Reagan made exactly the same mistake in the early 1980s with the apartheid, South African apartheid government, in which he vetoed any moves against the apartheid government, in which he continued to support the South African apartheid regime for their forays militarily into Africa. And then what overturned his veto in Congress was, in fact, public pressure by the citizens of the United States, longshoremen not offloading boats, etc., etc. So there is value in that. In much the same way, he had to face the non-aligned movement voting in the United Nations at that point, Ronald Reagan, that is, and in much the same way, the mobilization of the BRICS countries is the kind of counterpoint that plays the role that the non-aligned movement played. Yeah. So I think that there was a significant miscalculation, and I think, for one thing, the generations of young Jews who are growing up are not buying the victimhood narrative as easily as those who had parents and grandparents in the Holocaust as what they are doing. In fact, what young people are beginning to see is an atrocity in their name, and therefore not sustaining it to the same extent that those with direct relations to the Holocaust have done. And so, in a sense, I think what is emerging is Palestinian victimhood, is the idea that this is overkill in retaliation to whatever happened on the 7th of October. Right. And therefore, this is inhumane. And that is not just a backlash amongst young Jews at universities and in cities across the United States and across the world, but certainly is the ordinary imagination of citizens across the world is outraged because of not the mainstream media, but the citizen media that is so proliferating on social media. And that is what is the change. And you don't even have Russian TV playing in those areas, but it is social media clips that is going to.
Okay, Abdel Bari Atwan, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he is calling for what he termed a strengthened Palestinian Authority to assume responsibilities in Gaza. Is that possible? Is that feasible? What kind of credibility does the Palestinian Authority have?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that from the Secretary General. You know, they are treating us as a Palestinian, you know, as we are. We need sort of, you know, somebody to choose our future, especially in Gaza. You know, Anand, Mr. Anand, I am a refugee from Gaza. I lost more than 25 people of my families were killed by this genocide, by this ethnic cleansing. And now they are saying, look, let us look at what happened after you know, this war, this genocide in Gaza. Why we don't leave the Palestinian people to choose who actually govern them? If the resistance actually managed to achieve this kind of ceasefire in the end, and also put the Palestinian cause on the international map again, which was neglected completely for more than 35 years, you know, those people actually deserve to look at them. You know, the Palestinian people now actually siding with those people who are defending them against this Israeli genocide.
Nabeel, despite the ongoing violence, the ongoing war, there is also talk now what happens after this violence ends, when it ends. It's being referred to as a post-Gaza time. Israeli officials are proposing, among other things, a complete removal of all Palestinians from Gaza for resettlement in other countries. Israeli ministers have also been using some language like exploding a nuclear bomb over Gaza. That was subsequently walked back. Others, including the Prime Minister, have talked of the complete annihilation of the Palestinian people. I mean, what do you think will happen post-Gaza?
Well, I'm very discouraged by everything going on. Look, the discussion between Israel and the Biden administration over the future of Gaza and who will rule Gaza once the guns fall silent is an indication of a continued colonialist mentality. The root of the problem is in the occupation. The occupation must end. Self-determination for the Palestinians is the only way to go to solve this conflict. And yet this doesn't seem to sink in. Public opinion, of course, has changed in the US, especially among the youth. But unfortunately, this has not had any impact on the Biden administration. They continue to think that they're on the right path. The president himself is very much convinced that his position is the correct one. And as you say, there are indications that this very right-wing government in Israel is using the opportunity of this war to empty out most of Gaza and to establish at least a security zone, security settlements in the northern part, and squeeze whoever is left of the Palestinians into some corners in the south. If Egypt takes some of them, well and good. Others can be pushed into the Negev desert. But in the end, it's a very colonialist mentality that the future is not a very good one.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks to everyone for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.